January 1944, northern France. A pale winter sun hangs low over the frozen fields as a single American paratrooper drags himself toward an abandoned stone barn outside a small farming village. His chute is half buried in the ditch behind him, torn by the wind and useless now. He limps across the hard ground, boots heavy with frost, breath rising in short white bursts. Distant artillery thunders somewhere beyond the hedgerows. German patrols sweep the countryside after reports of scattered airborne drops. The soldier knows they will reach this area soon. He has no rifle, no radio, no supplies other than what remains strapped to his harness. He pushes open the barn door with his shoulder. The hinges groan. Dust falls in thin streams from the rafters. Inside, silence, stacked hay, old farming tools, a rusted milk pail, a wooden ladder leading to a loft half shrouded in shadow. He steps inside and listens again. Nothing but wind pressing through the cracks. In the next 9 hours, everything inside this barn, every tool, every board, every forgotten object, will determine whether he survives the German search parties moving steadily toward him. And that long, cold silence will not last. The events surrounding that lone paratrooper began long before he pushed open the barn door. By early 1944, northern France had become a tightly wound network of German defensive belts, supply roads, and patrol zones designed to counter the growing Allied air presence. Every week, reconnaissance flights crossed the coastline. Every month, small teams of airborne pathfinders were tested in limited operations to gather intelligence, disrupt transport, and pressure German command into a constant state of alert. The American airborne divisions preparing in England were being trained relentlessly for night insertions, rapid dispersal, and independent action in hostile terrain. For many of these paratroopers, it was understood that once they hit the ground, they might be alone, forced to rely on instinct and whatever they found at hand. Aircraft turbulence, heavy winds, ground fire, and navigational errors often scattered entire sticks of paratroopers miles off target. Some drops placed men directly into German-held countryside, isolated far from friendly lines. Northern France itself presented another challenge: a latticework of hedgerows, small villages, narrow farm tracks, and open fields bordered by low stone buildings. These rural landscapes created natural pockets where a single soldier could hide, and where German patrols could just as easily trap him. In winter, visibility stretched farther, sound carried sharper, and the cold punished every exposed movement. Any man separated from his unit risked not only discovery but hypothermia, exhaustion, and disorientation. German forces in the region, largely drawn from infantry divisions assigned to occupation and coastal defense roles, maintained strict patrol schedules. They monitored barns, farmhouses, and isolated structures, knowing these were common hiding places for downed pilots and stray Allied personnel. Their orders were clear: search thoroughly, take prisoners for interrogation, and prevent any possibility of resistance groups assisting the Allies. The presence of airborne troops, no matter how small the number, could never be ignored. Even one man could indicate a larger operation. In the months leading up to January 1944, several limited Allied reconnaissance drops had occurred across France. These missions relied on stealth rather than firepower. Paratroopers carried lightweight gear, silenced sidearms, and coded packets for French resistance cells. They moved through the countryside quietly, avoiding any engagement unless absolutely necessary. For airborne units, these operations served as both preparation and reality check. They reinforced the harsh truth that independence and survival often depended on improvisation. The paratrooper who landed near that barn belonged to one of these reconnaissance insertions. His aircraft had encountered unexpected flak as it passed over the coast, forcing the jumpmaster to signal an early release. Men exited into turbulent winds, scattering them across several kilometers. Radio silence had been ordered. Rendezvous points were set, but reaching them required evading German patrols that were already alerted by the aircraft's flight path. When he touched down in an open field, far from his intended drop zone, he immediately understood the gravity of his situation. The countryside was quiet, but not empty. Patrol dogs could be heard in the distance. Vehicles moved intermittently along a nearby road. Without a rifle lost in the landing, he faced the reality that any encounter with German troops would be fatal unless he relied entirely on the terrain and whatever tools he could acquire. That barn, sitting alone beside a frost-covered orchard, was not chosen out of safety but necessity. It offered shelter, concealment, and perhaps materials he could use to defend himself long enough to regain strength and assess his surroundings. What he did not know was that German troops, alerted by local reports of a low-flying aircraft, were already shifting toward the area. And every minute inside that barn was narrowing the distance between him and them. Inside the barn, the paratrooper's first concern was silence, his own, and the world outside. He crouched behind a stack of hay bales, breath steadying as he tried to slow the tremor in his hands. 9 hours alone does not begin with courage. It begins with fear, the sharp, cold knowledge that no one is coming, no one knows where you landed, and every sound in the distance might be the last thing you hear. He pressed his palm against the dirt floor, grounding himself. The barn smelled of old timber and dried grain. The paratrooper knew he had to transform this space from a vulnerable shelter into a place he could defend. The fear did not vanish, it simply hardened into focus. And in that focus, he began noticing objects not as remnants of farm life, but as tools that could buy him time against the soldiers already searching for him. That shift from desperation to attention defined the first angle of survival. He moved slowly through the barn, studying every beam, board, and rusty piece of metal. The tactical reality was unforgiving. He had no firearm, limited mobility, and the enemy held numerical superiority and local knowledge. But the barn itself offered structure, tight corners, narrow approaches, shadows that widened and shrank with the passing light. He pushed loose planks aside to understand the internal layout. He tested the ladder's weight, noting which rungs creaked loudly and which held quietly. He traced sight lines through cracks in the wall to the orchard beyond. The paratrooper had trained for urban fighting, for landing zones, for night movement, but not for turning a French barn into a defensive maze. Yet he adapted. He found a pitchfork resting against a wall, heavy but useful at close range. He located a wood-splitting axe lodged in a stump, its handle worn smooth. A coil of wire hung from a beam, and sacks of grain lay stacked near the back. Individually, these items meant little. Combined, they formed a defensive plan built from what a farmer had left behind. As he prepared the barn's interior, the technological angle of his situation emerged, not through advanced equipment, but through the absence of it. Paratroopers relied heavily on radios, compasses, and small arms to orient themselves and operate independently. He had none of these. What he did have were the unintentional technologies, embedded in the barn itself, the thickness of the walls, the weight distribution of the beams, the acoustics of the loft, and the resistance of the door's iron latch. He used the ladder as a sound detector, placing its base against the floor so that any vibration from approaching footsteps would travel upward. He tested how far the pitchfork punctured wooden boards at different angles. He weighed the grain sacks to see whether they could serve as improvised barricades. Even the draft moving through the cracks became a warning system. When it changed direction, he knew the barn door had been disturbed. Every simple object became a substitute for the military gear he lacked. Technology, in this moment, was not modern complexity but practical physics, the kind a soldier learns to respect when every second matters. Leadership in this isolated battle took an inward form. No officers were nearby, no squad was maneuvering. There was no plan beyond staying alive until darkness returned. Leadership became self-discipline, the ability to act decisively despite exhaustion, cold, and isolation. He made deliberate choices, when to move, when to remain still, when to risk noise, when to freeze. Paratrooper doctrine emphasized initiative, the expectation that a single soldier might need to continue a mission when completely alone. That mindset was now his only command structure. He rationed his energy, forcing himself not to panic when he heard distant German shouts. He rehearsed, silently, how he would react if the door opened. He positioned tools in accessible locations and marked, mentally, the safest escape route through a loose panel behind the hay. His leadership was not displayed through orders given, but through discipline maintained in absolute isolation. The final angle emerged from the enemy's perspective. German patrols in rural France were meticulous. They were trained to search barns first, knowing Allied pilots and paratroopers often hid among hay bales or in empty stalls. They operated in small units, often accompanied by dogs, and they approached buildings with suspicion and routine. For them, the barn was not simply a structure. It was a potential confrontation point where a cornered enemy might lash out. They moved slowly, communicating in clipped phrases as they checked outbuildings one by one. The local reports of parachutes only heightened their urgency. To them, the threat was not the single man but the possibility that he was part of a broader infiltration. Their caution created time, but it also created a deadly certainty. They would search every structure thoroughly, and the barn where the paratrooper waited would eventually appear on their route. Their boots on frozen ground, their dogs sniffing the air, their weapons ready, these were not abstract dangers. They were the direct, advancing consequence of being alone in occupied territory. And as those patrols drew closer, the paratroopers' preparations inside the barn shifted from planning to inevitability. The first sign came as a faint tremor through the wooden ladder he had placed upright in the loft. It quivered, just once, then fell still. The paratrooper held his breath. A second vibration followed, stronger this time, footsteps several, moving in a steady, coordinated rhythm across the frozen ground outside the barn. The German patrol had reached the orchard. He pressed himself deeper into the loft's shadow, one hand gripping the worn handle of the wood-splitting axe. Below him, the barn remained silent except for the soft sway of dust drifting through a cold shaft of light. The paratrooper listened as the voices grew clearer. At least 4 men, possibly 5. Their boots crunched through the frost. A short command was given. Then the sound he feared most, a dog barking sharply, the kind of bark that meant it had caught a scent. The patrol found out around the barn. One man tested the door. Another circled to the far side. The dog strained against its handler's leash. The paratrooper knew the structure well enough now to anticipate their next move. They would open the door slowly, send the dog inside, and then follow in a tight formation. He had positioned the grain sacks earlier as a narrow funnel, guiding any intruder toward a fixed point directly beneath the loft. That was where he would strike first. The hinges groaned as the door opened. Cold air flooded the barn. The dog entered, sniffing aggressively, claws scraping against the floorboards. The handler stepped in behind it, rifle raised. 2 more soldiers followed, spreading out just slightly, enough to clear angles but close enough to support one another. Their breath fogged in the dim interior. The dog's sudden growl shattered the stillness. It turned sharply toward the loft, ears rigid. The handler lifted his weapon to aim upward, and in that instant, the paratrooper acted. He released the wooden plank he had balanced near the loft edge. It crashed down, striking the handler's arm and knocking the rifle aside. The soldiers shouted. The dog lunged. The paratrooper dropped from the loft, landing behind the grain sacks that shielded him from direct fire. The dog reached the barrier first. He struck once with the axe's blunt side, driving it back. The nearest soldier fired, the round burying into the wooden post inches from the paratrooper's shoulder. The barn erupted into chaos, shouts, splintering wood, boots pounding across the dirt. The paratrooper moved with purpose, attacking the narrow space he had created. He thrust the pitchfork through the grain sacks, striking the first soldier attempting to flank him. A second man rushed forward, kicking aside debris. The paratrooper swung the axe low, connecting with the soldier's leg and sending him crashing to the ground. The German squad leader barked an order and pulled back toward the door to call for reinforcements, but the paratrooper had anticipated this. He had wedged the heavy milk pail against the door's inner frame earlier, and when the sergeant tried to retreat, the door jammed. Precious seconds were lost as the man struggled to clear it. The paratrooper seized the moment. He hurled the pitchfork across the room not as a weapon, but as a distraction. It clattered violently against the far wall, drawing a reflexive turn from the 2 remaining soldiers. He sprinted from cover, driving his shoulder into the nearest one. They hit the ground hard. The paratrooper grabbed the fallen rifle before its owner could react. A single shot rang through the barn. The second soldier dropped instantly. Silence returned, but only for a moment. Outside, more voices echoed. Additional German troops were approaching, alerted by the gunfire. The paratrooper dragged the wounded soldier aside and positioned himself again, now with a rifle and limited ammunition. He had survived the first assault, but the battle was only beginning. Through the gaps in the barn wall, he saw movement in the orchard. Shadows advancing cautiously between the trees. They tightened their formation, weapons raised, prepared to storm the building in force. For the next 9 hours, the paratrooper fought in waves, short bursts of gunfire followed by long intervals of waiting, repositioning, and listening. He shifted between the loft and the ground floor, using the barn's structure as both armor and trap. He fired through narrow slits, forcing the Germans to keep their distance. He blocked entrances with heavy tools. He moved silently, never staying in one place long enough for them to pin him down. Each engagement chipped away at his strength, but it also exhausted the German patrol. They had expected to capture one isolated soldier, not engage in a drawn-out close quarters battle inside a fortified barn. As dusk approached, the light dimmed, visibility narrowed, and the German commander made the final decision: pull back, report the contact, and wait for larger units. They withdrew slowly, frustrated and cautious, leaving behind casualties and a barn riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the paratrooper sagged against the loft beam, exhausted but alive. The 9-hour fight had ended not with a final charge, but with the enemy deciding he was no longer worth the cost. And now, as darkness settled fully over the countryside, he had one remaining challenge: escaping before the Germans returned with reinforcements. When the last German voices faded into the orchard, the barn fell into a deep, brittle silence. The paratrooper stayed still for several minutes, controlling his breathing, listening for the distinct rhythm of returning boots. None came. The firefight had ended, but the danger had not. The Germans would regroup. They would report the unusual resistance. And they would come back with numbers far beyond anything he could counter with a captured rifle and improvised defenses. His next move had to be deliberate and quiet. He began by assessing the interior of the barn, the shattered boards, the spilled grain, the scattered tools, and the bodies of the soldiers who had entered first. He retrieved what he could: ammunition from a fallen rifle, a canteen, a field dressing from a torn medical pouch. The 9 hours had left him bruised, dehydrated, and physically drained. His shoulders ached from the recoil of repeated firing. His palms were raw from swinging the axe and gripping rough wood. He had no illusions about his condition. He could not survive another engagement of that scale. Outside, the orchard was dim under a fast descending sky. The winter dusk worked in his favor. Patrols in rural France shifted to slower movements after sunset, relying on lanterns and short-range visibility rather than extended sweeps. He slipped through the loose panel behind the haystack, the escape route he had planned early in the day, and emerged into the cold air. The field was quiet. A distant engine rumbled along a road but did not approach. He moved cautiously, using hedgerows as cover, staying low when he heard distant conversations or the barking of dogs. His training guided every step, but fatigue pressed heavily against his instincts. Several times he paused, fighting to remain alert. Each pause reminded him how narrow the margin of survival had been inside the barn. He had not won a battle in any traditional sense. He had simply endured long enough to make the Germans reconsider their pursuit. Hours later, after navigating a patchwork of fields and narrow lanes, he reached a small cluster of farmhouses. Here, according to his briefing, local resistance contacts often provided shelter to downed airmen and isolated soldiers. He approached cautiously, tapping the side door of a darkened farmhouse in a pattern he had memorized. Moments later, a cautious voice answered in French. The door opened a fraction, then wider as a lantern illuminated his uniform. The local cell members took him inside quickly. They noted the cuts on his hands, the dirt on his uniform, and the exhaustion etched into his expression. He offered a brief explanation, limited to what he was allowed to share, and they nodded, understanding the broader implications without needing details. Reports of gunfire in the area had already circulated through the village. Now they knew the source. The resistance provided him with food, water, and temporary shelter. They cleaned his wounds and arranged for safe passage toward a rendezvous point used by Allied intelligence teams. Over the next day, guided discreetly through rural lanes and hidden paths, he was moved farther from German patrol zones and eventually reunited with Allied personnel operating behind enemy lines. His account of the 9-hour fight was recorded, compared with local reports, and sent through encrypted channels back to command. The incident was noted as an example of survival improvisation under extreme conditions, a single soldier transforming a simple structure into a defensive position capable of delaying numerically superior forces. It also highlighted weaknesses in German patrol doctrine, particularly their reluctance to advance aggressively once initial casualties occurred inside confined spaces. For the Germans, the aftermath carried its own weight. The patrol that had first engaged him filed reports describing an unexpectedly fierce resistance from a lone Allied soldier. Higher command reviewed their statements and ordered more aggressive clearing procedures for isolated structures. In several subsequent searches across the region, German units approached barns and farm buildings with heavier weapons and increased caution, revealing how one man's fight had subtly shifted their local posture. For the paratrooper, survival brought no celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement from his superiors and a return to operational duty once he recovered. He did not view the barn as a victory. He viewed it as necessity, a place where he had used every object available, every instinct sharpened by training, and every ounce of endurance remaining in him. And yet the consequences of that day travelled farther than the small field where it began, shaping operational habits, informing later training, and demonstrating again how individual survival choices can ripple across a broader front. Now, with the memory of the barn and the long cold hours still vivid, he prepared to return to the war, knowing he had lived through a fight few ever faced alone. In the quiet that followed his escape, the barn remained fixed in the paratrooper's memory, not as a battlefield, but as a reminder of what war often becomes at its smallest scale. Large operations are planned months in advance, shaped by generals, maps, and supply chains. But survival, in its rawest form, reduces conflict to the simplest elements: a man, a space, and the will to endure until the next hour arrives. What happened inside that barn did not change the course of the war. It did not alter front lines or influence major campaigns. Yet it revealed something fundamental about the nature of combat in occupied Europe. Soldiers often found themselves cut off, disoriented, and forced to improvise with materials that had nothing to do with military design. A pitchfork, a rope, a loose board, a sack of grain, objects of daily life became the tools of survival. War seeped into every barn, every field, every quiet corner of rural France, reshaping the ordinary into unexpected forms of resistance. For the paratrooper, the 9 hours were neither triumph nor tragedy. They were a test, one that he never asked for, but answered because the circumstances left no other choice. His endurance reflected the broader reality of airborne operations during the war. Men trained to land in darkness, scattered across unfriendly terrain, trusting that their preparation and adaptability would carry them through moments when planning collapsed. In the years after the conflict, the barn itself returned to silence. Farmers repaired the bullet holes, new hay filled the loft. Visitors walked past it unaware of the fight that once echoed within its walls. This, too, is part of history. The way extraordinary moments fade into ordinary landscapes, leaving behind only the memories of those who lived them, and the lessons carried forward by those who study them. The paratrooper's story endures because it captures a truth often overshadowed by larger battles: that survival in war is built not only on strength or weaponry, but on awareness, resourcefulness, and the capacity to remain calm when surrounded on all sides. It shows how a single individual, armed with nothing more than what he could gather from a barn, can resist long enough to alter the decisions of a much larger force. And it reminds us that courage in war is rarely loud. Often it is quiet, cold, and alone, shaped in the shadows of a place where no one was supposed to fight at all.